Hey everybody, welcome to Science Friday number 8. First of all, happy holidays to everyone. And before you jump on my case in the comments section about saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, War and Christmas and all that stuff, don't do it. You do it and I'm going to find you and give you a Christmas noogie. I say happy holidays because this broadcast goes all over the world. It's just the best way to address the most number of people. But if you want to take it as Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Festive Kwanzaa, any way you want to take it, you take it that way because I just want everybody to be happy. Anyway, this week, two things. First thing is happy holidays. No paywall on this broadcast, so everybody gets to watch it. The second thing is we're going to talk about something that's kind of topical this week, something that's fun and related to the Christmas holiday, which is the Star of Bethlehem. Now, as many of you know, according to the Gospel of Matthew, the Star of Bethlehem was a magical star that appeared in the sky just before the birth of Jesus Christ and was alleged to have guided the Magi, the three kings, to the infant Jesus where they came bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So the interesting thing about that is, people have searched for years for a non-miraculous explanation for what the Star of Bethlehem could have been. And basically it falls down into one of five things. First thing is that some people think it could have been a meteor. Others think it could have been a comet. In the past 100 years or so, since we've learned more about the structure of space and the universe, some people thought it might have been a supernova. A great conjunction, which is an alignment of planets. That's another explanation. Well, that's four. The final one is that it's a myth, and there really was no celestial event that you can basically correspond with the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem. So I want to go through each of these possibilities just real briefly and talk about the evidence for and against. And as I do, there's something I want you to remember that I used to tell all my students in astronomy classes all the years that I taught it, which is that there's a good deal of intellectual chauvinism afoot whenever you talk about ancient astronomy and the view that the ancients had of the way the heavens worked. And that works along these lines. These days, people are smarter than they were thousands of years ago, so any idea that we have now is automatically better than any idea that those folks had back then. And I always disputed that with my students. We may have access to more information now than those folks have. We have better instruments with which to examine the world around us, but smarter, I don't necessarily buy that. There were some awfully bright people that existed in ancient times, and if you look at the science and the mathematics that these folks came up with, it's quite impressive. A smart person several thousand years ago would be a smart person today. It's just that facts have changed. The amount of human knowledge has increased over the millennia, but those people were smart back in those days. So as I go through this and I tell you this is what the ancients kind of thought about this, don't look down your nose at that, because sometimes there were some experiments and some observations people made thousands of years ago pertaining to things like astronomy and physics that were actually quite profound and essentially entirely correct. But let's go down the list of possibilities. So the first thing is a meteor. It is very unlikely that the Star of Bethlehem was a meteor because it appeared in the sky and existed for several weeks, long enough to guide the Magi to the birthplace of Jesus. Well, a meteor, as all of you know, a meteor doesn't last that long. It's several seconds in the sky at most, and that's about it. So it's very unlikely to have been a meteor. But there's something similar to a meteor. What if it was a comet that appeared in the night sky? Now, comets can be around for several weeks. As most of you know, a comet is a ball of mostly ice and gas. They spend most of their time way out in the outer reaches of the solar system. Most of them originate from a place called the Oort cloud, but as they follow their path into the inner solar system along what's usually a highly eccentric orbit, as they get close to the sun, all that stuff heats up and they start to glow. You can see not only the glowing comet itself, but the tail of gas that it leaves behind in its wake. Well, here's the deal. It's very unlikely to have been a comet because ancient astronomers were well aware of comets and what they were. So they knew all about comets a couple of thousand years ago. Now, they didn't know what we know about them now, but they were familiar with comets because people have been looking at the sky for tens of thousands of years. And they tracked objects like that. They understood what a comet was and that it would appear and it would eventually disappear, that it had a tail. The other thing about comets is that they're unlikely to have worked their way into any sort of a creation myth because most peoples of that time thought that comets were the harbingers of bad news. So both in terms of what people knew and their feelings about comets, it's a little unlikely that a comet would have been interpreted as a star because people just knew the difference. So it's probably not a comet. So let's go down to the third thing. This is something that's cropped up in the last 100 years ago, which is that it could have been a supernova. Now, the supernova idea is very interesting, and for a long time, that idea had a lot of traction. But here's the problem. A supernova is a star that explodes. It's one of the most violent events in the universe. And there are several different types of supernova, and that's something we can talk about later on, but it's an exploding star. And when these supernova go off, the remnants of the supernova spread out into space pretty rapidly, but they persist for a long time. You can see supernova remnants for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The only supernova that is known to have occurred that would have been visible from Earth with eyeballs, because back in those days, they didn't have telescopes. They didn't have infrared detectors, ultraviolet detectors, all the things that we can use, X-ray detectors, gamma ray detectors. We can see supernova these days across the electromagnetic spectrum. Back in those days, it was eyeballs. That was the only way you could see it. So the only supernova which would have been observable to the human eye that occurred anywhere during that period was about BCE 185. So it would have been a long time before the birth of Christ, 185 years. We really don't see any other remnants that you could put back in the proper time period. So it's very unlikely to have been a supernova, although a supernova would best, it's probably of all the explanations, other than the very last one, the best thing that kind of fits the facts as laid out in the Gospel of Matthew, if you happen to adhere to that. So then, something that's gained a lot of traction in just the past few years is something called a great conjunction, just an alignment of the planets. And the interesting thing about it is, as thoroughly as we understand the mechanics of the solar system, you could take a laptop computer and run simulations to show what the alignment of the planets looked like right around the time Jesus was born, with very high degree of certainty. And there were certainly some conjunctions that had occurred back during that period of time. Now, none in exactly the time period that we're talking about, but there were several that were fairly close. And a conjunction of the planets just means when the planets all line up in the night sky. It doesn't mean they're physically close to each other, because they're not. But along your line of sight, they're all sort of lining up. The planets all travel at different speeds around the sun, including Earth. So everything in the sky moves along kind of complex paths. But every once in a while, you'll look up and you'll see something like, for instance, Jupiter and Venus, two of the brightest planets. When they get really close together, they make a very bright object. And the last time I saw a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, it was about a fifth of the size of the full moon. I mean, it was pretty big. So that's something that's gained a lot of traction lately, too. But here again is where the chauvinism thing comes in. The ancients were well aware that the planets were different than the stars. And this goes all the way back to Greek astronomy and before. They knew planets were different. They named them differently than they named stars. And they understood that they moved against the background of stars. They understood things like retrograde motion. They got all of that stuff. So the ancients would have understood a conjunction of the planets. So based on the fact that they knew what they were talking about when it came to the difference between planets and stars, it's unlikely that that mistake would have been made. They would have recognized a planetary conjunction for what it was. So that's the first four things on the list. Let's talk about the last one, that's just a myth, which is probably the most likely thing. Now, I'm not, I hate to crash your buzz during the holidays. Christmas and in this country is, of course, a recognition of the birth of Christ for Christians. But there's no astronomical event, at least that we're aware of, that both lines up time-wise and kind of fits the narrative of the story. It's just really difficult to find anything in astronomy that really does that. So probably the best explanation is that the Star of Bethlehem is mostly myth. There might have been something that they thought they saw, if in fact all of this actually happened. But it's real difficult, at least in terms of modern astronomy, to find anything physically that we can prove that meets both the narrative and the type of astronomical events that you could prove would have been happening at that time. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm weighing in on number 5, which is that it is a myth. Anyway, I think I finally got one of these things in under 10 minutes. I want to wish you all the happiest of holidays possible. Again, enjoy this one. There's no paywall, so everybody that subscribes gets to see it, and I will be seeing you. Cheers.